My filming spot is in the coldest part of our entire apartment. We're gonna do this quick and then I'm gonna dive under my heated blanket or something. What's up, friends? Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to, I think, the first book related video that I've done since 2022. So I'm pretty excited. I hope you're excited. Today we're going to be talking about the best and worst books that I read in 2025. I will admit I am filming this in the middle of December, so there's a chance that a really great or a horrendous book will slip in at the last minute, but I'm hoping that's not the case. So let's start on a good note with my favorite books of the year. And by that, I mean my favorite books that I read in 2025, not the best books that were published in 2025. I mostly read backlist, just as a warning. I'm like perpetually at least 2 years behind, which you can tell by the fact that the first book I'm going to be talking about is Babel by R.F. Kuang. And as a disclaimer, the books for best and worst are not in any particular order except for the last book in each category. The last book in each category is going to be my absolute favorite and my absolute least favorite of the year. So Babel. I gave this book 5 stars. I feel like everyone on BookTube talks about R.F. Kuang all the time, positively or negatively. Right now, it's all about Calabasas, but I know that a bunch of people were talking about Babel when it came out, so I don't know how much of a synopsis is actually needed here. Babel is a historical fantasy dark academia book. It's set in an alternate 1828 where silver and language translation form the basis for the world's magic system. It's a little hard to explain, but basically, practitioners of what is called silverworking take advantage of the gaps in language translation, where words in one language don't necessarily have an exact match in another language. So practitioners will take those 2 words, carve them into silver bars to try to physically manifest the meaning that is lost in translation. Kind of abstract, it makes more sense once you read it. Our main character, Robin, is a young boy who was orphaned in China and taken to London by an Oxford professor to train in multiple languages and prepare to join Oxford's translation program, which is the foremost center for silverworking in the world. Although silverworking is Robin's passion in life, he does become torn when he realizes just how much the British Empire has and is planning to take advantage of other countries, including his home country of China. Babel is one of those books that I think is pretty polarizing. You either love it or you are very disappointed by it. This was actually my second attempt to read the book. The first time I picked it up, I got maybe 50 pages through it and then I put it down for months because I found it dull to read. The second time I picked it up, however, I found it much easier to sink into the story, and I couldn't believe that I had ever had a problem with it to begin with because I ended up finding it so entertaining. Hello, my love. Please, we just started filming and you're already getting in the way. It can be dull and dense to read, I will admit that, especially at first, and especially if it's not your type of book. I think there are 2 main things that people are interested in when they're picking up Babel: translation-based magic and colonial themes. So let's get into the first one a little bit. To enjoy this book, I think you need to be a nerd. You need to enjoy paragraphs explaining translation and linguistics and silverworking, because it can get a bit dry and it can sometimes feel like you're reading almost an academic paper, especially with all of the footnotes that are in the book. If you like that idea, however, the idea of learning about translation in a fantasy setting, then this is honestly a great book for that. Just don't expect the magic system to be super flashy or fantasy heavy though. This is honestly just like more advanced technology than what was actually available in 1828. Like some of the silver bars make, I think, the trains run faster and smoother. As for the colonial themes, a lot of the complaints that I saw about Babel is that those themes were too basic and too heavy-handed. And sure, that's true enough. If you already have an understanding of how colonial powers like England have exploited other countries and orchestrated disasters for the sake of that exploitation, then you're really not going to learn anything new in this book. To be fair, I don't really think R.F. Kuang promised that you were going to learn anything new here. I might be wrong, I haven't done a deep dive into her interviews. Either way, yeah, plenty of people have a greater understanding of colonialism than this book offers, but there are just as many people who haven't thought about these things before, and for them, Babel meets them where they are. And I do think it is important to have books that meet people at the different levels of education that they are at. For ideas regarding colonialism and racism in academic spaces, this is entry level. If you're someone who has already lived these things and are intimately familiar with it, you've grown tired of it already from a personal perspective, there is a chance that this book will just irritate you and feel way too pessimistic. I remember from my best friend who is Asian, that was her main complaint, that she had already lived through racism in school and she didn't need a book to tell her the same things that she already knew. That's fair enough, but I didn't go into this book wanting to be taught any of those things, and perhaps that's why I liked it. I do think Babel level might be the first fiction book I've read that explores colonialism. More interestingly, I do think it's the first fiction book I've read that explores the violence of colonialism in its many varieties, and the idea that change can't always be brought about through pacifism. That you can't always hold a moral high ground, say that all violence is bad, and also topple the powers that have oppressed you. What I really loved about this book is seeing how Robin changed throughout the story. And my heart just hurt for him, for all of the injustices that he put up with that he didn't even realize he was putting up with until it was too late. One of the things that has stuck with me to this point is that we still don't know what Robin's birth name was. He was taken to London and his birth name was lost to him and to us. He was stripped of that, and it was only the beginning of everything that was drained away from him. This book is about colonialism and exploitation down to the individual level. It's about the tragedy of seeing everything that you are and were overwritten, and then the internal crisis you have when you realize that in some ways you may have been a participant in that through your own ignorance, if nothing else. And then it's about how you reconcile that conflict. What do you do now that you've realized? There are characters who are so angry, characters that swallow down the hurt, who keep their heads down, those who try to prove that they are better than their origins, and then those who try to bring down the system of oppression through any means necessary. I will admit the characters aren't the most fleshed out. There is character development, but it's mostly for Robin, and either way, all of the characters have their roles to play in highlighting different aspects of colonialism and racism in academic spaces, but I loved all of our main characters regardless. I didn't always agree with their choices, but R.F. Kuang made me respect and understand their choices. She made me hurt for them. I actually teared up towards the end, which is rare for me. I don't often cry at media nowadays. I don't really feel like I'm doing a great job of describing this book and why I loved it so much. There are just so many aspects of it that I related to so much. I cared about these characters so much. I wanted better for them. I spent the whole book hoping that things would turn out all right for them. Next, we have Sky Full of Elephants by Sibo Campbell. Also 5 stars. I think every book that's in the best category has 5 stars. So you know what? I'm just not going to mention it from here on out unless it's not a 5-star. This is a speculative fiction book where one day all of the white people in America walk into the nearest body of water and die. Our story starts a year afterwards when Charlie, who was previously wrongfully imprisoned and is now a professor in this new world, receives a call from his estranged daughter, Sydney. Sydney is half white and she witnessed her mom and her white stepfamily walk into the water and die a year ago, and since then she's been in isolation. Up until now, when she heard that some of her white family members might still be alive in Alabama, but she needs a ride to get there. Sky Full of Elephants surprised me. I thought I would like this book, but I did not think I would love it to the level that I did. It was unexpectedly beautiful and emotional. Almost instantly, I regretted having bought it as an ebook because there were so many lines that I was highlighting in the ebook version I just loved and that I wish I could have annotated in a physical copy. There were so many sentences that I found so poignant and uniquely descriptive. With this book, I was expecting something thriller-esque, which it very much is not, and that maybe would have disappointed me because I really went into it wanting a thriller-esque book. But what this book actually was done so well that I couldn't possibly have been disappointed. To me, Sky Full of Elephants feels like healing an open wound. The overarching thing that's discussed here is the generational trauma that Black people in the United States have experienced for hundreds of years. It is discussed broadly, but it's also discussed in subsets, if that makes sense. There's just so many topics that Campbell touches on in the book, including the violent impact of white tears, how young Black children experience racism, the unjust incarceration of Black men in particular, etc. Some people may feel like Campbell did too much in this book and he should have honed his focus more, but I feel like what it did was show how racism and the actions and impact that comes from it just piles up and up and up on top of Black people. You know, it's never just one thing, it's a million things that they're faced with and they have to swallow down. And I'm saying have to swallow down because a major theme of the book is about the anger that all of these characters have felt for so long and how they have bottled that anger inside of them because it didn't feel like it had anywhere to go. And now with all of the white people gone, it feels almost like they have been robbed of their right to anger because the objects of their anger are no longer there. This book is like opening a door for the anger to go through. That's why I say it feels like healing. It feels like a release of tension. It's angry, but it also acknowledges that anger must be felt, that they deserve to be angry, and that they deserve to process the complexity of their emotions. Sky Full of Elephants is a multiple POV story, with it mostly switching between Charlie and his daughter, Sydney. Sydney's chapters deal with the experience of being biracial. I do think her experiences are more exaggerated than some because she was raised with this self-hating racist mentality that is simultaneously so sad because at the time of this story, she's 19. She's still a child who deserved better. But it was also so irritating because it was baffling that she didn't see the issues with the mentality that she was raised with. That being said, I do think there's a lot here for biracial people to relate to because a lot of her story deals with grappling with the feeling of not belonging in the Black community, but also feeling like she needs to change everything about herself to be more palatable for white people. It's also about her realizing the extent of the hurt that's been done to her and to Black people in general. I think some people might find this book a little too preachy, but I think the emotions and the messages the book is trying to convey are so caring that it's worth being blunt and spelling things out just to make sure that people who need to hear it hear these words. The writing style was beautiful. I loved the analogies and descriptions that Campbell used. It was just so lovely and warm and sparkling with magic, honestly, especially in the latter half of the story. Although I do want to note here that the latter half of the book does feel kind of disjointed from the first half. It almost feels like an entirely different story and setting, which it kind of is. But I feel like the transition from the first half of the book to the second half of the book could have been a lot smoother. So that's like one criticism that I'll offer you for Sky Full of Elephants. Community is another theme that I would be remiss not to mention, and I'm mentioning it here because Campbell's style of writing makes the narrative sound admiring, even awestruck by Black people. I just feel like it was written with so much love. Even with all of the pain and trauma that's discussed, Black people in this book are described as overflowing with happiness and color, full of light and kindness, and able to come together and thrive despite struggles. It was almost like a love letter. And I could see criticisms being made about these depictions. I just could see people criticizing how much Campbell seems to almost idealize all of them, but I'm not the person with the education or the background to be analyzing that aspect of it. To me, it really just felt like Campbell wanted to show love and admiration for the Black community. The execution of the story wasn't always what I hoped for, but I respected the choices that Campbell made. Throughout the book, for instance, I was on the edge of my seat waiting for certain realizations and confrontations to happen. And those things didn't happen in the way that I wanted to in the book, but I will admit that what I wanted was petty. And what we actually got fit the theme of internal healing a lot better. So I couldn't be too upset about it. I think the characters sometimes lacked depth and were reduced too much to very few personality traits. Charlie and Sydney as our main characters are more developed, but even with Charlie, I knew his anger and all of his deep emotions, but it otherwise felt like he was a doll being used to demonstrate those emotions rather than a person with unique mannerisms and personality quirks. However, this is not a big enough criticism for me that it ever really impacted my enjoyment of the story. Overall, though, I thought this was a really well thought out premise. I love speculative books that actually think out the logistics of their what if scenarios. I don't just want the emotional and psychological impacts. I want to know about the infrastructure too. And Sky Full of Elephant delivered that. It talked about airports, it talked about schools, it talked about the internet, all of that, how all of that still functioned after the what if scenario. With books like this, I also don't always expect an answer to why the what if situation happened in the first place. So I was pleasantly surprised that Campbell did actually answer the question. Campbell didn't really leave any loose strings, although I could see some people wishing that this book was a little bit longer. I was also a little disappointed by the length. I could have done it with another 100 pages, but you know, the author had a message to convey and he conveyed it. I think all of the questions that you set out wanting an answer for are answered, but the ending does leave you with questions of what comes next. I can easily see this becoming a comfort read for me. Like, these are not my struggles. I have no claim to any of these experiences, and yet even I felt healed after reading this. I even think this would be perfect for adapting to a limited TV series. All right, now on to some of the quotes. Time slowed down, sauntered like hours did in places like Chattanooga and Charleston and Savannah, a notoriously southern phenomenon now spread like honey over everything. Water crushed in waves, lapped and babbled, unwilling to respect in silence what was otherwise a graveyard. Anger long repressed, angry for more reasons than he could fully comprehend. Anger he'd smothered all his life, only to be made even that much angrier for having done so. To his surprise, anger surfaced in tears, not rage. In stillness, not violence. People forced to be alone and in the dark, but who taught themselves to shine so bright they could always find each other. Now we have a couple of translated works, starting with The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, translated by Stephen Snyder. What an odd, distressing yet soft book that was. Months later, and I still feel like I can't really put into words how I feel about this book. This is sci-fi, I guess, that takes place on this small, unnamed island where objects disappear, not only physically, but from everyone's memories. Basically, for example, one day the whole island will wake up and they'll realize that hats have been forgotten. Any memories they have associated with hats are forgotten. Any emotional attachments they have are gone. They are required to destroy any hats they have in their possession. And eventually, hats are fully forgotten from the island as if they never existed. And this forgetfulness is enforced by the memory police, who ensure that nobody remembers or holds on to items that have disappeared. Our story follows a young novelist who discovers that her editor is in danger because he's one of the few people who remembers things that have been forgotten. I guess this is better described as a dystopian with an authoritarian surveillance state, but that implies a story that is more action-packed and violent than this actually was. When you really start to understand the premise, it is horrific to imagine how things could go, the things that could disappear and what that would mean. While the memory police didn't go the route that I expected, and it ended up somehow worse and more abstract than I thought it would go. I think the memory police makes you question the value of things from trivial to vital. You can survive without perfume, for example, but wouldn't you feel like you lost something if perfume was wiped from existence, if you could no longer smell the perfume that you wore on the day that you were married? It made me feel sad for these characters for sure, especially because they don't realize the gravity of what they have lost and what they are losing throughout the story. For the most part, nothing physically violent happens, but it does feel like everything that makes people human is being chiseled away at. It still felt violent and dark. The writing style almost has a foggy, hazy feel to it. Again, you don't see much of the violence, but it's in the air, it's in the things that are taken away from them. You can see it in the way the characters submit to it all, the way they have no fight left in them. At one point, I think the main character says that it feels like her soul is breaking down. In some ways, this book reminded me of both The Giver and World War II books, specifically talking about the Holocaust. The Giver, obviously because of the message of the importance of memory and all the little and seemingly trivial joys that collectively make us human, and World War II Holocaust novels, because in the memory police, not only are those who retain their memories persecuted, stolen off of the streets, or in hiding to save their lives, but with the disappearance of things, you also see a withering of people. Also, the memory police did at times feel like an allegory for Alzheimer's because of the clear idea that you lose a part of yourself with every memory that you lose. I want to give a special shout out to the translator Steven Snyder for this book. I feel like a lot of translated Japanese lit that I've read can feel detached and stilted. It's a style that takes some getting used to, I think. But the memory police didn't have as much of that detachment to it. It flows so much easier and more naturally in English, I think, than some of the other Japanese translations that I've read. And I was so impressed by it that I looked up the list of works that this translator has done. And it turns out that they've also translated Confessions, which is another Japanese book that I was so impressed by the translation. I do have some very minor criticisms, just things that weren't my favorite thing at the beginning of the book. For instance, the narrative is interwoven with this short story that the main character is writing throughout the book. While I enjoyed the short story for what it was by itself, it did feel like an odd break in the narrative. However, the parallels between the short story and the main story become so clear by the end that I was like, I take it back. I take it back. The short story was absolutely necessary. I do wish we had gotten more of an answer for how and why things disappear in this world, but I understand that that's not the main message of the story, and also it is probably just more unsettling to not know whether this is a man-made conspiracy or not, and perhaps it is a spoiler to say that we don't get a very clear answer, but I feel like this is a thing that you probably should know before you go into it, because I know this is the kind of thing that would really upset some people. And the only other thing I will say is that the ending wasn't what I had hoped for, but it had a devastating beauty to it, and I think that really summarizes what it felt like to read The Memory Police. And I do have a couple of quotes to share from this book too. A heart has no shape, no limits. That's why you can put almost any kind of thing in it, why it can hold so much. It's much like your memory in that sense. Even if a memory disappears completely, the heart retains something, a slight tremor or pain, some bit of joy, a tear. I have to make do with a hollow heart full of holes. That's why I'm jealous of your heart, one that offers some resistance. Next, we have Human Acts by Hong Kong, translated by Deborah Smith. I don't know that this is going to stand up. Okay, 5 stars again, like every other book in this category, but I want to say I would give it even more stars, I think. I actually don't know if the final book that I'm going to talk about is my absolute favorite of the year or if this is my absolute favorite of the year. Human Acts just stunned me. I was not expecting to read such a good book when I picked it up. This is a historical fiction about the Gwangju Uprising, which were student-led demonstrations that occurred in South Korea in 1980 and which were violently suppressed by the South Korean military. Hundreds of people were killed, even more were injured and or arrested. From what I read, the actual number of people who died in this uprising is still debated to this day. It took 50 pages of this book for me to start looking up the Wikipedia page on the Gwangju Uprising and on the author, and for me to say, oh, of course Hong Kong has won a Nobel Prize in literature. Human Acts is just so instantly impactful. It's not sanitized or sensationalized. It's not fast-paced or over-the-top gory like you might expect a book about a massacre to be. It just feels traumatic. The book doesn't even open with the uprising. It opens with the aftermath. The author's writing just struck me with its simplicity at times, with how such simple sentences and facts were so perfectly placed and shared in a way to strike you right at the core. Often when I think of historical events like this, I think of the violence that's done to the living. Of course, it's impossible to ignore the violence that is done to the dead as well, especially when it is sometimes the defining feature, let's say, of an event. But I think this redefined the way that I think about violence. Now I think it would be impossible to consider pain over once someone has died. Now, violence upon a living person or violence or disregard done upon their bodies after their death feels like a violence against a person's very soul. Human Acts talks a lot about the dehumanization of both the people who were still living and the people who died in the massacre. So many people brutalized, so many people whose names and faces and lives were erased, both in killing them and in certain cases denying them the opportunity to be mourned after their death. It was devastating. I remember seeing some reviews while I was still in the middle of this book criticizing it for being cold and emotionless, and I legitimately got upset reading those reviews because I just could not understand it. I don't know how you could read Human Acts and not see it for the traumatic disassociation that it is. We sidestep a lot of the main event and we only really see it in quick flashes, as if those quick flashes are all that the POV characters can bear to think about at a time. But the brutality only began at that event, and we are witnesses to everything that followed afterwards. It doesn't hold your hand for a second. The facts are as they are. And perhaps that's why some people thought it was cold and emotionless, but I think the purpose is to make sure that you can't hide away from it. Human Acts deeply saddened me. After reading it, I felt tender and fragile. I felt hollowed out, and a small part of me even felt guilty for surviving the massacre, even though I wasn't alive at the time that it even happened. The PTSD and survivor's guilt in this book is gut-wrenching. It's quite the depiction of how violent oppression has ripple effects across not only the people who were there at that time, but across the entire country, and how it can shake the very trust that you have in your country and in the foundation of your own lives. The writing was beautiful in its own very bleak way. Some people might have trouble following it because it changes perspective with every chapter, and it goes back and forth and sideways in the timeline, but the author always brings it back. Even tangents that seem out of the blue are tied back to the themes. And I want to say one of the most interesting perspectives I have read in a while came from this book. If you liked Frankenstein and Baghdad, you might like this book because I think there's some overlap in the themes here. And with this following right after The Memory Police, it occurs to me that I think a lot of the books in my favorite sections show that I have an interest in humanity at its core and what kinds of violence can be inflicted on a people besides just physical. I feel like I'm getting emotional just talking about it. On to my absolute #1 favorite book of the year, Sunburn by Chloe Michelle Howarth. I fear I will never emotionally recover from this book. If Hosier was a lesbian in 1990s rural Ireland, this is the book he would write. Sunburn is about a teenage girl named Lucy who lives in a small, conservative, religious town where everyone expects her to fall in love with her childhood best friend, Martin. But then Lucy starts to notice her school friend, Susanna, in a different light. I didn't think I was going to be so impacted by this book because the beginning really wasn't clicking for me. It has a stream of consciousness style to it that isn't really my vibe, and I was getting kind of bored with the tangents and the various musings. It felt like it was taking too long to get to what I was really here for, which was Sapphic yearning. But once we got there, oh wow, the yearning, the infatuation, so beautifully written. I will admit, There were a couple of weird internal comments when the narrator was thinking about her love interest, but in all fairness, teens can be kind of grossly horny, so who am I to judge, right? But that aside, I found myself highlighting so many quotes in this book because they were gorgeous and raw and just so in love. Howarth truly captured what it feels like when you first fall in love, especially when your first love is queer. Because it's not just love, it's a realization of yourself and how every world you've lived in and will live in has changed. That feeling is so sharply vibrant, like the sun revealing everything before you and hurting you in the process as well. Howarth depicted that beautifully through one of the most accurate depictions of awkward, anxious, and simultaneously arrogant teen energy. I think this stands as a great romance read for the summer, although more of the literary fiction variety than of the classic romance genre. More than that, it is a heartbreaking coming of age that explores not only the initial realization and first love, but also compulsory heterosexuality, complex mother-daughter relationships, the fear of coming out, and the particular pressure that comes from living in a small town. It was nostalgic and messy and intense, and at times it came so close to my own heart that it felt like it was bleeding me dry. I finished this book and I wanted to reread it immediately. Our characters and their choices weren't always easy to like, but it was so easy to understand their internal conflict and their fear and why they made the mistakes that they made. I think if you're a lesbian or a bisexual woman, you absolutely should read this. I felt seen in ways that I think I needed to be seen on page. And of course, I have some quotes. She took her Eucharist before me, and I quietly apologized to Jesus for the downgrade from her tongue to mine. How could they not love me when there is nothing left of me but love? My love now seems to be an aggressive political thing. It is the ceaseless search for an identity and then committing to that identity. All right, and before we move on to the worst books of the year, I do want to give some honorable mentions. We've got The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. Great nonfiction, kept me very engaged. Bat Eater and Other Names for Corazang by Kylie Lee Baker. A good horror book that also explores the dehumanization of people before and after death. And Uprooted by Naomi Novik. Such a good fairy tale vibe. Now on to the worst. This was harder to choose for two reasons. The first is that I did a lot better with DNFing books this year. There were so many books that I just put down after a bit and I just couldn't be bothered with anymore. And I didn't want to talk about those books in this video because I feel like I didn't read enough of them sometimes to really talk about them. The second reason is that I decided not to include any rereads in this video. And some of the absolute worst books that I read this year were rereads. The only 1 star I've given this year was a reread. But don't worry, I will probably be talking about that in another video. Because of that though, every book that's in this section is actually 3 stars, which is not a bad rating. For me, 3 stars is a perfectly fine book. I could have lived my life without reading it. I would have lost nothing if I hadn't read it, but I can understand why for some people they like it more than I did. So we're starting off with the only sequel that's on this list, Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. This is the second book following Annihilation. Funnily enough, I gave Annihilation 5 stars, so this was a step down for sure. Annihilation is about Area 6, this mysterious, dangerous, ecological disaster zone that was formed some years ago by some mysterious event. Many expeditions have crossed the border into Area X to study all of the strange things that happen in there, but each one has failed because the members have either not come back, or if they do come back, they have gone crazy, committed suicide, developed cancer early on and died, etc. Just a bunch of weird things happening. Annihilation abruptly starts after the 12th expedition has crossed the border into Area X. Authority, the book that I'm going to talk about in this video, covers the agency that has been funding and putting together all of these expeditions. It's a corporate office politics heavy book. And listen, I can enjoy some juicy office politics, but the office politics in this book was a drag. The first half, at least, dragged on so much. I finished this book kind of hating it, and then I read the third book in the series, and I could at least say that Authority was worth it only because it bridged the gap into book 3. Authority just felt like a prologue, like exposition before the actual story starts, like a book's worth of setting you up to start thinking about the far-reaching impact of Area X. And look, all of the books in this series was difficult for me to read. I don't know what it is about Jeff Vandermeer's writing style, but if you lose focus for even a second, the whole sentence sentence slips away from you. He'll also spend a bunch of time describing things, and yet for some reason, I find that I can't hold on to the words enough to actually visualize what he's saying to me for the most part. This does kind of change in book 3, I have to admit. The point is that Vandermeer's writing style is difficult enough to grasp in an engaging book, let alone in this book that mostly focuses on office politics and not as much on what's actually happening in Area X. The horror in this book for me felt more implied than it was present. It didn't actually feel like a horror book to me until past the 50% mark. And even then, it was more horror that was spoken around rather than directly described to us. I didn't actually feel scared even a little bit until 80% of the way in. If you're a fan of gothic horror, maybe you'll like this more than I did, because I do feel like kind of has a gothic vibe to it. And I personally am not really a fan of gothic most of the time. I will say that this answered some questions about Area X that you have after the first book, but it still leaves you with enough questions that you want to read the third book. Again, this feels more like a filler between book 1 and book 3. Next, we have Lucy Undying by Kirsten White. This is a Dracula retelling where Lucy, one of his victims in the original story, ends up surviving and becoming a vampire. Centuries later in 21st century London, Lucy meets this woman named Iris, whose family has built an empire out of a health MLM and a dark secret at the core of it. I was disappointed by this. I should have loved this book. I liked the premise. I liked the messages behind it. I even liked the idea of vampirism in an MLM because I thought that was just so funny and oddly fitting. Maybe if it was condensed to like half the length, it would have been a better book. And it's kind of funny because I read another Kirsten White book this year called The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, and I actually did like that book. With Lucy Undying, first of all, the beginning is just so disjointed. We switch between POVs and sources, I think a bit too often for my taste. It would have been better, I think, if each piece had been a little bit longer. It kind of felt as if every part should have been a short story or was intended to be a short story, but it instead ended up being a novel. The pacing is also off. It drags on longer than I would have liked, and I honestly think I would have DNF'd this book if I hadn't decided to just kind of skim it for the latter half, maybe. And maybe that counts as cheating. It was a very involved skimming, if that makes a difference. I mostly did it because I just wanted to see if I had guessed all of the plot twists right, and I did. The only ones that I didn't guess just weren't shocking regardless. In terms of vibes, there's a touch of Wednesday, the show, and Tim Burton. Just a little something theatrical in the gothicness. It also reminds me of Penny Dreadful, the show, and of Interview with a Vampire in its writing style, but like just a touch, okay? This book doesn't have nearly the same levels of gothicness as any of those sources, and it's not as good as any of those sources. It's just too modern and casual for that. The writing of it, especially in the modern day chapters, just veers a bit too much into corny to be fun or authentic in my opinion. And I don't love how many chapters end in a single line that's clearly meant to be punchy or a cliffhanger that doesn't actually leave me on the edge of my seat. It just kind of annoys me that we are once again switching to another POV. And maybe the issue is just that this was clearly written for a younger audience than I am, because I was also annoyed by how much the author would explain things that I feel like the author could have just trusted the audience to understand. What I will compliment it for is being unabashedly sapphic. It was interesting to see how the author maintained the original canon of the story while still exploring this idea of Lucy being alive and sapphic. Lucy as a character is pretty sad, and I did feel kind of emotionally attached to her throughout the story. You can see through the various sources in the book that she was just a young girl, so desperate to be loved and wanted and understood that she was willing to compromise every part of herself. And I think that's something that a lot of people would relate to. There's also the aspect of her being queer in a time where it was obviously not acceptable, and it was sad to see her bury that part of herself. And it was also sad to see how her naivety and desire for love was used to manipulate her. You can see betrayal coming from the very beginning, and it does make you feel for Lucy, I think. This is definitely a book for someone. I just don't know that I would recommend it to anyone who's like in their mid to late 20s. I think it's definitely for a younger audience. I would say teens, maybe even young teens. This is a story about forgiving your younger self for the things that you think they did wrong, and internalizing the fact that they and you deserved better and deserved to be loved. All right, next we have Wake Up and Open Your Eyes by Clay McLeod Chapman. Also a disappointment. I was so intrigued by the premise for this one. This is a horror book about an epidemic where people who have been consuming far-right media become demonically possessed. Our main character Noah has been dealing with the changes that he's been seeing in his parents since they've started consuming this far-right media and buying into conspiracies. 30s, so he's not super concerned when his mom starts talking about the Great Awakening. However, when his mom stops answering his calls, he does become concerned enough to drive over to their house in Virginia, and that is where the story starts. My biggest issue with this book is that the symptoms or manifestation of the possession felt really sloppy, and I don't want to go too into detail describing it, but I will say that the very first instance we see of how possession has changed someone is very sexual, and the possession is characterized very often with obscene, shocking sexual behavior. And listen, I'm not a prude. I'm not generally offended or scandalized or disgusted by sex. I do, however, dislike it when it seems to serve no purpose in a story. I tried seeing the purpose in the sexual content in this book, but it just feels like it was there for shock value. It felt like it was being used as easy shorthand to try to make the reader feel squeamish and unsettled. And every time it happened, the only thing I could think is like, is this the only way that you can make someone uncomfortable? Is this really the best way for you to convey your message? To me, it felt cheap and unoriginal. Like, wow, sex as a way to shock people. So innovative.
Florals for spring. Groundbreaking.
I'm cool if it happens once or twice, but by the midway point, I was rolling my eyes because it seemed like the only way the author knew how to convey a changing obsessive personality. And again, I don't really feel like it was the best, or at least the only way, to make whatever commentary they're trying to make. Why not go the route of extreme religious idolatry, or the route of mimicry to the point of cloning, or you could even do hypersexualization, but maybe focus the object of their desires more? The other symptoms of the possession, when it actually appeared, did make more sense. With the other symptoms, it did feel like the author put more thought into how far-right personalities would become exaggerated into demonic possession. The second half of the book is better. The author starts taking more time to describe other kinds of horror, just more on the psychological horror of falling for a cult, and I did appreciate that. The book is broken into 3 phases, by the way, and phase 3 was my favorite part of the book because it changes narrative style and starts incorporating a mixed media format that I really loved. I wish the book had been more of phase 3 style. The previous 2 phases were different POVs from before and during the epidemic, and it explores not only Noah's perspective as someone watching his family fall for alt-right propaganda, but also explores the different avenues through which a person can become susceptible to propaganda. From how I'm describing it, it sounds like the book only criticizes right-wing people, which obviously it does, but the book also criticizes left-wing people as well. There's a part where a character says that the madness and rot in the country was always there. People just weren't paying attention until it personally impacted them, which I think is an appropriate criticism to make. But I think the most interesting criticism that's made of the left is probably that it's harder for right-wing people to deconstruct the propaganda that they've fallen for if the left does nothing but make them feel stupid and lash out at them. I'm gonna say something kind of contradictory now. I think I would have liked this book more if I hadn't listened to it as an audiobook. However, I highly recommend the audiobook. It has a full cast, it has some fun sound effects, a great listening experience. It's just that I am not a big audiobook person. It's just harder for me to focus and really enjoy a story in that medium. I'm just saying that maybe if I reread the book physically, maybe I would like it just a smidgen more. If you've been feeling like you're going fucking crazy because all of a sudden you realize just how right-wing your family is and how unwilling they are to listen to actual evidence that disproves their conspiracy theories, you should read this book. It does feel kind of validating, like it decided to personify how crazy this all feels. Next we have The Starving Saints by Caitlin Starling. This is a medieval horror following 3 women in a besieged castle. The castle has been under siege for 6 months and food is starting to run out to a point where they have to start considering the worst options. But then all of a sudden, saints from this world's religion show up mysteriously, led by their constant lady, capital C, capital L, by the way. The castle is overflowing with food now, and the people fall under the spell of their saviors, falling into a hedonistic madness. Like I said, it follows 3 women, a paranoid former nun turned sorceress, the knight who has been tasked with guarding her, and a young serving girl focused on vengeance. The Starving Saints was a deeply okay book, as in so deeply fine that I struggled with what to even say about it. I want to preface the rest of my review by saying that this book is absolutely for someone. This has a perfect audience. It's just not me. I was so bored during the first 30% of the book to the point where I told my partner that I was baffled at how Starling managed to make cannibalism boring. It gets more entertaining when the saints show up, but only marginally so. The writing style of this book just feels so slow and distant to me. Anything horror related happens in your periphery vision. That's what it feels like. We have on-page descriptions of cannibalism, but the way that they were written meant that for the most part, none of it felt intense to me the way that I think it should have. There were a couple of moments of intensity where I felt the emotional impact of people not quite being in control of their own actions or not quite having a grasp on what's actually happening around them, not being able to trust their own perception of things. But those intense moments were very fleeting. And other moments that I really feel like should have had a stronger impact just felt like a bummer to me. With our POV characters, at no point did I ever feel like they were more than characters in a book. Yes, they had motivations and flawed personalities, but for the most part, they were stereotypes of characters. If you have seen the marketing behind this book, you've seen the elements that they've been pushing to describe it, I just want you to know that pretty much every element marketed about this book has less to do with the story than I expected. Don't read this if you're looking for a cool nun story. Don't read this if you want to learn and see the powers of these so-called saints. If you read this, you're going to be introduced to some characters in, I think, the first chapter. Don't expect them to be very present at all. Don't read this if what you want is B-related horror, which is a thing that I saw in some reviews. Don't even read this if what you want is Sapphic horror specifically. Yes, all of those elements are there, but not to a satisfactory level. Don't even get me started on the Sapphic parts. The couple doesn't make sense to me in context. The whole romance could have been easily edited out of the story, and it would have made no difference at all. So who should read this? If you like medieval horror, sure, give this a shot. If you like struggles for the control of minds, then this might satisfy that. I will say that the official synopsis calling this book a fever dream was the most accurate aspect of the marketing. The faulty perceptions and not being able to trust what the narrators are seeing and describing to us was actually the most interesting part of the book to me. If you like slower stories, you might also like this. A part of me wonders if I would have liked this more if I hadn't been craving an intense action-packed story at the time that I had read this. To me, The Starving Saints feels like you're drifting on top of the horror rather than immersed in it, and I had wanted to be immersed in it. It also almost feels like a short story because it's so confined to this one space, and the time frame I think is shorter than you would expect it to be. If you're a Mona Awad fan, I could see you maybe liking this. Hard for me to say because Bunny by Mona Awad, one of my favorite books, and yet I found The Starving Saints kind of mediocre in comparison. But the reason I say that is because sometimes Awad's writing style has a similar distance to the horror. All's Well, I think, didn't always directly look at it. And so I think there are some similarities that can be drawn in that kind of style. Although I will say I still think The Starving Saints was more removed even than All's Well was. It's a long shot, okay? But I could see why a Mona Awad fan would like The Starving Saints. And now onto my absolute least favorite book of the year, ironically the only one that I own physically. Water Moon by Samantha Soto Yambao. This is the one that pissed me off so much that I had to stop every 50 pages just to rant at my partner about it. Water Moon starts in a pawn shop in Tokyo where you don't sell items. Instead, what you pawn off are your life choices, your deepest regrets. Hana has been learning the family business from her father, learning how to guard all of these life choices that they buy off of people, and it's finally time for her to take over the business. But on her first day as the new owner, Hana wakes up to her father missing, the shop ransacked, and a pawned-off choice stolen away. And at that moment, a stranger stumbles upon the pawn shop and oddly enough offers to help Hana instead of asking for help like their visitors usually do. So the two go off on an adventure across various magical worlds and dimensions to find Hana's father and this stolen choice. And doesn't that sound like the most amazing premise ever? Doesn't the idea alone sound so whimsical? I truly have never been so disappointed by wasted potential. For the most part, the writing style was actually pretty good. It does get kind of pretentious at times and it feels like it's trying to be deeper than it actually is, but this author is not bad in the words she chooses to use. Her ideas are amazing. A pawn shop that deals in regrets, and that's like the least whimsical, fantastical world she comes up with. You see a lot of settings throughout this book, and each one is incredible. They genuinely blew my mind a little bit, wondering how she came up with them, wondering what her inspirations were behind them. Pacing was her biggest issue, though. The execution of all of these ideas ruined the book. The author created these beautiful, intriguing worlds, and then moved us from one to the other without giving us the chance to fully process or appreciate each one. We were spending a page on things that I felt merited at least a chapter. I was was honestly astonished and flabbergasted by the pacing. It felt more like I was reading the author's notes or first draft on what would later be fleshed out. We were moving past scenes too fast. On one occasion, we were building up towards a conflict that I thought was going to be very engaging and action-packed, and instead what we got was a summary of what happened within one paragraph after the fact. The author just kept taking the wind out of the sails of everything that could have been great in this book. Also, the romance develops too fast. Attraction and infatuation are one thing, but we were getting kind of dramatic emotional development on page 80 that you would expect after like 3/4 of a movie, and kind of a things have been racking up for the past hour and we're gonna lose control, and yell about our insecurities in the rain and then kiss about it kind of way. And they're like constantly having conversations that I feel like most people would only have at like 3 a.m. The author just kept giving us emotional payoff for things that we hadn't earned. I was just begging for her to expand upon literally anything. I needed so much more of an explanation on so many things. It made me actually mad. At one point early on, Hannah says, "What question is there left to ask?" And I rolled my eyes so hard. Like, you've just gotten started. You've asked maybe one question. What are you even talking about? But that is the attitude that I feel like the author had about her own story. Great ideas, solid writing style, gorgeous book. I mean, the potential was endless. And yet the author ended it decisively within a page, if not within a fucking paragraph, every single time. She had a wealth, a treasure trove of world building ideas, and she didn't do any of them justice. I feel like she should have just given all of these ideas to Miyazaki. At least we would have gotten a good movie out of it. If I'm being nice, I will say that it did get better towards the end. She did start taking time describing things a little bit more, as they should have been the whole time. I'll even say that I am glad that I read the book all the way through, because there were some plot twists that were a little interesting to discover. But I still think this book could have been so much better than it was. It was the biggest disappointment for me. It should have been longer. She should have taken more time developing all of the worlds and developing the characters and the relationships. I'm not always a big proponent for series, but I feel like this could have, at least been a duology, and I would have been totally okay with that. I actually almost gave this 2 stars, but the ideas alone were so good that I begrudgingly gave her another idea because it was interesting for myself to imagine them. I would give this author another try because maybe she just needs a bit more experience in writing novels, but I will be mad about it. I'm fired up all over again, and I do have an appointment that I need to get to pretty soon. So that's it. Those are my personal worst books of the year, not including any horrendous rereads that I've read. If I read any other books that should be a best or worst, I'll make sure to include it in a wrap up. I will see you in the next one.